Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of New Role, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Joanne Hindle, chair at the Stafford Railway Society and the Stafford Railway Building Society. With over 30 years of experience in financial services, Joanne has a robust legal background with a speciality in risk management and commercial law. She previously served as the head of legal at AXA Assistance UK and was the first CEO of IFA Promotion and ended her executive career as the corporate services director for insurance provider Unum. Joanne, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Pleasure. Delighted to be here.
So I'd love to kick off with just your story and your story to becoming a chair and plural career.
Yeah, delighted to talk you through it. So, as you briefly mentioned, like most people, long sort of executive career, finishing up with a number of board-level executive roles, but along the way had a number of trustee or governor or non-exec type roles, the sorts of things you can do whilst you're still working full-time. And so knew I enjoyed the whole board process, governance process, serving on committees. You mentioned also a lawyer by background, so it all sort of plays to that sort of background. So, as many people, made redundant from my last executive role and very much took a decision sort of there and then. The time had come to look for a plural, non-executive portfolio career. I felt I'd gone a long way in the executive world, was very happy with where I got to, as I say, being an executive board member for a number of years in a number of different companies, and felt I could share a lot of that with other boards, and felt for me the time was right to move on to not having to do bluntly day-to-day management. So it's good stuff and it's important, managing your team, leading your team, mentoring people, etc. Absolutely key, but I felt I'd been there and done it. And it, for me, was time to move on to the non-executive, which is what the name implies, i.e. not doing the executive bit, but hopefully bringing expertise, guidance, support, critical eye, critical friend to other boards. So essentially, I just started looking. This was back in the day when adverts were in papers. Particularly the Sunday Times was the paper of choice. And so just started applying for a number of different roles. And within months, but not weeks, and perhaps this is something we can dig into a bit later, how long these things can take, was delighted to be offered a role on the Shepherd's Board, which was a great start because it was just as an NED. So at that time, not a committee chair, not a board chair, although to serve on some committees as well as the main board, which again, I think is something really helpful. And again, we might want to explore later, how broadly you need to be involved in the firm rather than just serving on one or two things, how rounded you can get. So Shepherd's was then and remains a super organisation in that sort of no 2 days were ever alike, let alone any 2 years. So rapid change. Literally after my first board meeting and before my second, the chairman moved on and there was a new chairman, which led to a reshuffle. And I'm pretty sure, actually, although it's some years back, I was then asked if I would chair one of the smaller committees as part of that reshuffle. So very rapidly kind of moved on. Had a number of years there chairing different committees. I chaired, I think, everything except audit, where you really do have to have an accountancy background, which I don't have. Pretty much chaired everything else, and then was delighted when the chair stepped down to be asked to take on the chair role, which I then did for quite a number of years. In the meantime, and as with all roles, of course, once you've got one, it's so much easier to get others because you can talk knowledgeably, you know what you're talking about. Your examples, your experiences are very real to the new roles. Was then able to move on and became chair of a small building society for a time. Now also chairing the Stafford Railway Building Society. So very much a lot in the mutual space. But also not just that, 3 years ago was delighted to be asked to join the board of a small bank, the Bank of London and the Middle East, where I chair their nominations and remuneration committee. Started off as remuneration and then we folded nominations into it, so took on the bigger role there and serve on a number of their other committees as well as their main board. And then very recently, through new role, have taken on a new chair role, which I start officially at the beginning of May. So quite a broad and varied portfolio that has gone up and down and changed over the years.
Fantastic. I mean, there's so many things there you touched on that I'd love to dig into. Going back to the beginning, you talked about, as an executive, how you'd had a number of non-executive roles in parallel. And that's one of the things we often see people asking about. Should I wait until I finish my exec career? And I've always told people, no, you can take on one non-exec role. I wouldn't take on a chair while you've got an executive position, but you could take on one non-executive role, ideally an advisory role, so you don't have the fiduciary responsibilities, because if things really kick off, you have to be all in, and that can be quite challenging. But how did you think about that balance, and how did that work for you as an executive?
Yeah, it's such a good point, and one I'm very happy to expand on. I mean, what I did was never the official sort of non-exec on a commercial board. So over the years, I served on and chaired a large number of industry committees and boards. So for insurance industry or whatever it may be, chambers of commerce. So was always involved in the sort of wider commercial environment in which I might be working, and was always happy to do that. And as I say, in time, take on chairing of those committees. But also I was a school governor for a while. And then whilst I was at Unum, I was asked if I would take on the chair of a national charity, which was called Employment Opportunities for People with Disabilities, which I did and was able to do alongside a full-time career. I think most executives find once you get to a certain level, you're able to perhaps take a couple of hours during the day to attend a board meeting, particularly now virtually, and you just make up the work in your own time, nobody minds. And in fact, as an executive, I always felt it was really helpful for other executives to get that broader view. When you reach a level in your executive career, and perhaps all you've done is executive in the commercial world, something which broadens your view is very helpful for your executive role, let alone for moving on to a non-exec. It brings that different experience, different worldview, different voice into the boardroom, even from the executive perspective.
So true.
A range of charity, trade association, school governor, but getting used to the idea of being on committees, the way committees work, learning about how to influence, how to make them work, how to support them, and then the chair role, before ever moving on to the non-exec official sort of role.
Brilliant. That's so true. I remember as an executive, I used to get very frustrated with some of the boards I worked with, where I'd be sort of sitting there thinking, how do they not get this? This is so obvious. And then when you sort of sit on the other side of the table and you're being asked to make recommendations, decisions, you're like, how am I supposed to make a decision with this information? And suddenly it makes you much better as an exec about thinking about how do you take a board with you? How do you communicate? Not just in the boardroom, but also outside of it. Just one of the things, you've worked across quite a variety of organizations, and certainly something I found as a private equity investor, that could be very helpful, being able to cross-pollinate experiences from different industries. But there's a sort of balance to strike, because there's also a certain value to having really deep knowledge in a given industry. How have you found that has impacted on your ability to contribute as a board member, that breadth versus depth?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think you do need a good mixture of both. You need enough depth and enough breadth. So I'll answer the question a little more in a moment. But so I do find it difficult when interviewing. And of course, that's something increasingly as chair one does when interviewing for new NEDs. Somebody who's had a very sort of standard long-term executive career in one organisation. It's sometimes quite difficult to see how they can broaden their view beyond, well, we've always done it this way at company X, and understanding the companies Y and Z might do it very differently. So, I mean, I'm lucky that the vast majority of what I have done has been in financial services. And so understanding the regulated environment, which is so key in financial services and so key at board level, pretty much goes across all my experiences and is readily transferable. The other thing, though, that I hope people have thought was useful is that the thing I love about financial services is because it is so broad, you can take that basic skill, but you can always find something new to learn. And I remember saying in my interview for my first building society role that no, I had never worked in the building society sector. And for me, that was why this was really interesting. because it wasn't same old, it was something really quite different as a way of stretching my brain, and hopefully therefore meaning I would be more involved and more active because it was new and exciting, rather than, oh yes, been there, done it, oh yeah, same old, here we go again. So I think it's got that combination of allowing you breadth and depth with still that, as I say, that real core of the regulated industry.
And are there different lessons that you've taken from some of those different sectors? I remember, for example, in the education space, which is one I used to invest in, I was always struck by how good the language schools were at selling. And we would bring that expertise into, say, the K-12 sector, where they were brilliant at delivering a quality product, but not as effective at selling. Are there sort of examples like that you've taken from different industries where they've been, as private equity investors, we'd often take people out of the automotive space who were just brilliant with driving efficiencies through and the insights that we took from those organizations. But are there particular things you've taken from the different sectors that you've worked in that you've been able to bring to others?
Very much so. And I think that, again, is one of the key things that a non-exec can bring without in any way ever breaching competition law, let me get absolutely straight, is being able to share those experiences or knowledge or practices and say, well, I've seen it done this way elsewhere, might that work here? So I think I give examples going sort of both ways. So I've worked with a number of smaller organisations, but also with larger ones. And I think it's very helpful to be able to share some of the processes, procedures, some of the things that larger organisations have in place and almost take for granted, with smaller organisations that are perhaps struggling with how do we move to that next step? How would we develop in this way? Well, in a bigger organisation, let's be proportionate, you could scale it down, but here are some things I've seen that work well and could apply from larger to smaller.
Could you maybe give an example?
I suppose very, very live in the financial services sector at the moment is operational resilience. So huge amounts of work going on at every organisation to show the regulators, and indeed show their own boards and investors, shareholders, whatever it may be, that the firm is operationally resilient, not just in pandemics, but in other events that could occur. And I mean, at the large organisation I'm involved in, the bank, as you can imagine, a very, very big project, lots of work going on, but some very good practical lessons from that I was able to share with the couple of smaller organisations where I'm on the board to give them ideas of how I've seen it done elsewhere that, again, was probably too big for us, but proportionately, here might be a way we could approach it. Because this was a very new topic with not a lot of guidance from the regulators and a lot of people scratching their heads to say, how do we go about this? And so it was very helpful to be able to say, well, somebody who's putting tens of thousands into this, here's some ideas of approaches to how they've tackled this completely new project or program, if you like.
Got it. And without breaking any sort of confidences, can you be more specific than that?
Well, anyone who's been involved in operational resilience will know that essentially on day one, everyone had this just blank sheet of paper. And one of the things you had to do was identify your what are called important business services, IBSs, which become quickly a technical term in the business. And so I was able to share, as I say, without reaching confidence, what some of the work at the bigger organisation had shown would be the IBSs to help perhaps direct the other firms in ways to say, well, perhaps that's where we look then, rather than scratching our heads about, well, is it this or is it that? And should we have 20 of them or 50 of them or 2 of them? It gave a kind of scale and it gave some examples of what might be an IBS that might be relevant. So that's a very sort of real and live, a very recent example. And then sort of going precisely the opposite way is that the smaller organisations have tended to be mutuals or a third sector, charities, whatever, with that huge focus, therefore, on the member rather than the shareholder necessarily. And so it's been very useful to be able to take that member focus and share that with perhaps more shareholder-driven or typically larger organisations and say, again, here's some great examples I've seen of how to listen to the member voice in a smaller organisation that perhaps gets lost at a bigger organisation, so you can transfer that sort of thinking back. And before you ask, a real example of that would be one of the things we did at a smaller organisation was speed dating with members, which we've done actually both live and also in the pandemic, we've done on screen. So literally the whole board is there and a properly recruited research group, so through a proper research house, it's all done under Market Research Society rules. And then a couple of board members will sit with a couple of members and move round literally after 3 or 4 minutes just to say, what do you think of us? What's good? What's bad? What products have you got? Why those products? What service have you had? All the sorts of things you would expect, but in a very short, sharp, brilliant way of gathering data, of course, but really brilliant way for the board to get to hear the actual voice of the member. And I mean, to give a very, very real example of how interesting it was, the first time we ever did it was, again, small mutual. And we sort of knew what our members were like. They were typically older, typically probably not that well off. You could we all had a picture, it turned out. We all had the same picture. So imagine our faces when what walked in was not that at all. It was literally a very different demographic, much younger than we'd expected. There were university lecturers. There were a couple of pilots. It was totally not what we thought at all. We hadn't sold our products to the people we thought we had in the least. This is a number of years back before one had to do a lot more research, as now one was required to do. And so I've shared that idea with the larger organisations who perhaps are more stuck in the traditional, we have a market research firm and they do a report and eventually that filters up to the board, but you haven't got the real voice.
I love that. That's such a brilliant nugget. Actually, it reminds me, we used to have an investment in Pret, and we'd get the board members to go and do a day a year at least at the tills, similar sort of concept. But I love that idea of going from small to big and big to small. And it's something actually I think about a lot now with some of the things we're able to do as a startup that's been built from bottom up with around people analytics, around our finance. Like we now have better access to finance than I used to have with FTSE 250 companies we'd taken private. I can take a photo of an expense and within, instantly, I can see that showing up in our P&L, cash flow can drill down from top level statements. And I just think, wow, how on earth would I get those organizations? And they should be able to sort of access this, but it's such a challenge. And definitely that's been an eye-opener for me to see how much there is to learn the other way. And the same actually on people analytics is the other big one. The number of boards I see who say people are our most important thing. And actually they've got no clue how their people are doing. They're relying on the executive narrative and
Yes.
they've got no data. Whereas I think startups have been really good and there's some really exciting platforms coming out that are helping organizations doing that. So I love that example that you gave. Thank you very much for that. You touched also earlier on advertising. You got your first role through an advert in the Sunday Times, which is the world has changed a lot since then. And I think people now, if they go and advertise a role, tend to find it's more trouble than it's worth because they just get inundated with inappropriate applications. And obviously, as New Role, that's one of the things we believe in open hiring, that the role should be open so that people off the radar can put themselves forward. How do you think about that balance? Every review into diversity, I think, has advocated advertising, but I think a lot of organizations feel like it's still too much work. What's your thoughts on that open versus closed hiring?
I found it tends to depend on the organization, which is an odd answer, I know, to the question. So some organizations are very, very happy to advertise themselves and deal with it and say, okay, we will cope with the flood and very quickly sort out the dross, the inappropriate, and narrow it down. And for those organizations, that seems to work enormously well, and we've managed to recruit really good non-exec directors or committee chairs. Other organizations, and this isn't always a factor of size at all, it might be the smaller ones that are more prepared to cope with doing it themselves, much prefer to go the headhunter route. And again, typically I've found you end up with a good pool of candidates. So it seems to me it's very much the mindset of the HR team. And I think what I've learned over doing this for getting on for, well, it's certainly over 15, getting on for 20 years, is you do well actually to listen to the HR advisors in the firm as to what works best for them. because I've tried on a number of occasions to not go that way. And I'll be honest, it's not worked as well. So I've tried to persuade a firm that's used open advertising that perhaps the time has come to move on and not all the work ourselves, to use a headhunter. And frankly, I've got one example in mind where it didn't work at all. And they kind of went, I told you so. And I kind of went, you did, I was wrong. And sort of vice versa. Having said that, what you do have to be aware of, whether you're a board member, chair of noms or chair of the board, is that whatever route they're using, it is properly as open as it can be. And you've had the conversation with the headhunter about how they are going about it to make sure they're getting as diverse a group of potential candidates as possible. But also advertising, that you've thought through your advertising, that you're advertising in a way that will be accessible to as many people as possible. I mean, going back to what I said up front, it used to be in the Sunday Times. Well, if you didn't read the Sunday Times, woe beside you, you would not find an advert for a non-exec director back in the day.
Yeah, we're certainly big believers in the power of open hiring and the research that results in a bigger talent pool. There's some research done in the US by a professor at the University of Chicago that shows you tap into this bigger talent pool and you remove that cognitive bias of having an intermediary, whether it's someone in the organization or an executive search firm, reaching out to the people they think are right. And the challenge, though, as you say, is dealing with the flood. How do you get something that means that doesn't become unmanageable? And that's, still a problem we're trying to work on. But what we are seeing is, interestingly, we're getting more first-time non-execs coming through as a result of that approach, people who are off the radar, which we think must be a good thing, getting fresh sort of perspectives in.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to, you said in that sort of first role that you had the chair transition out after your first board meeting. And I imagine you've since seen a number of chair transitions. Talk us through what you've learnt from those. What does a good chair transition look like? What does a bad chair transition look like?
So a good chair transition is one where it achieves what it needs to achieve. So I was about to say a good chair transition is one where it's very smooth. But actually, that may not be what's needed. So it may be you need to transition an old chair out in order to have some change and for it not to be smooth, for it to be a bit rough for a few meetings and a few months. So you have to know what it is you're trying to achieve with the chair transition. Is it something incredibly smooth where everything's going well and it's a matter of the person has come to normal retirement age, date, time on the board, whatever it may be, and you've got an orderly succession, and then that hopefully will just be smooth? Or it may be one where, frankly, the chairman perhaps needs to go and won't see that they need to and has to go, and then probably it won't be very smooth for a few months. I mean, I can give an example of taking over at Shepherd's, where it was incredibly smooth. It was absolutely fine. And the previous chair knew I was coming in and he was ready to go, and I took over, and that was fine. And we had a couple of meetings which went sort of okay, but they weren't great. And I was thinking, is it me as a new chair, although I have chaired other things? And so I, as you would, sort of sat and gave it quite a lot of thought and talked to the chief exec. And we felt that perhaps, although we had thought they were, the board was actually not aligned around the strategy. So perhaps under the previous chairman that hadn't come out as much, but my perhaps different style allowed it to come through. And it was coming through in a way that wasn't desperately helpful, because what it seemed to be happening was we'd get so far on a decision and then people would start picking at it. And I sort of reasoned this, perhaps it's because we don't really agree on where we're trying to get to. So I called a kind of strategy day, got one in the diary as soon as we could to say, okay, new chairman, explained everything I've just said to you. Let's go right back. What is our strategy? And did the very simple, stick up on the Post-it notes what you think our strategy is. And it was a classic, because within 5 minutes we all looked and everyone went, we're not aligned, are we? Because the Post-it notes were literally all over the place. And we spent the rest of the day getting alignment, and almost magically, that solved the problem. From then on, we knew where we were going. If people started picking at things, we could say, well, but the strategy we agreed is we are going to do this. Oh, yes, we did, didn't we? Right, we better do it. Or we didn't say we'd do this, so why has this paper come to the board? What are we talking about this for? So there was an example where, although the actual transition was fine and was smooth, what came out afterwards showed there was a sort of a deeper problem that did need addressing. Typically, luckily, I've worked with boards where it has been more of the planned and the smooth approach. But one thing I always say when I'm recruiting non-execs is, sort of don't get comfortable. I may be recruiting you as a non-exec or as a chair of this committee or whatever. Trust me, something will happen and we'll need to shuffle everything around. You may need to take on a committee chair sooner than you expected, or we may need to say, could you step up and take on a bigger committee because you're more experienced and we need to bring in some new blood because somebody's retired unexpectedly or sadly ill health or whatever it may be. There's always something that means things have to move around, not necessarily in a planned way, which for me is part of the excitement of doing the job. You may think you're a non-exec and it's 6 meetings a year and it's okay, I get the papers, I go to the meetings. It's never like that.
Got it. So just going back to that transition, what, if you have someone coming to you who's a new chair taking on their first role, what would be your key tips for them to do in advance of that role?
I mean, it's very obvious, but I'm a very basic, practical sort of person, so there won't be anything sort of highly scientific here. Talk to everybody you possibly can, and probably more important than talk, listen. So lots and lots of one-on-one meetings and chats, find out what people are thinking, how they're feeling, non-exec, exec, and perhaps even some people who aren't on the board, maybe people who attend the board but aren't on it, people who are on some committees perhaps but don't come to the board. Get as wide a view as you possibly can of how people are feeling. And I think feeling is probably the key word. I mean, partly what are they thinking, but so much of what goes on in boards and committees is about the feel, getting the environment within which the difficult decisions, the strategic decisions, whatever it may be, can then be taken. Sort of back to my example, if every time you come to take a decision you find you can't because people are picking at it, what is the underlying problem? If somebody is always turning up flustered, annoyed, angry, not happy with the papers, what's going on there? Why is that? If we start from the start point, and I do, that people are doing this because they want to, if they've turned up in a bad mood and they're not happy, what's driven that? That's not because they don't want to be here. Fundamentally, they do, so something's gone wrong. And also, for them coming in new, the other thing is I would say to them, don't forget you're doing this role because people think you can do it. So what experiences have you got? Sort of listen to your own inner voice that says, wouldn't it be better if we did it this way? You have got experiences which are relevant. Don't assume you just have to do everything the way it's always been done, but temper that with not throwing everything up in the air all at once. So evolution, not revolution, but do recognise you will have particular things to bring. Because you do see some new chairs or chairs of committees who kind of go, well, it's always been done like this, so I better not do anything different. Well, actually, the reason we've changed it round and put you in as a chair is because we would like a bit of new thinking, new blood, new ideas. So it's that balance.
Got it. Okay. Super helpful. Now, one of the board members I spoke to who's worked with you as part of my research for this call came up with a wonderful line where they said, Joanne is the boss. And they said that, and they said, I mean that in a good way. She controls the boardroom in a really good way. And this was a really experienced board member who was a chair themselves in their own right. And I'd love to understand how you go about that. What are the mental models that you use to get someone like that feel so bought in, but at the same time so comfortable with you controlling the meeting?
It's a very, very interesting question because, as with most of these things, I suspect most of it is subconscious. I don't really consciously do it. I think a large part of it is exuding the confidence that you do know what you're doing, and that over a series of meetings, people understand that that is not a false front, that you really do know what you're doing. So what I mean by that is you are prepared. And I think for me, that is absolutely key. So it means you've worked with the chief exec and or the company secretary on the agenda, which might be quite a big piece of work. It sounds easy, but exactly what items are on the agenda and why. Are they the items we want to be there or not? And if not, why not? Where have they gone? And why have these items cropped up? Because if you've got the wrong items on the agenda, you can guarantee the board members will be turning up going, why are we talking about this? I thought we were talking about that. What's happened to that? Where is it? You've lost the meeting before you even start. So being very clear in your mind, what items do I expect to be on this agenda, these 8-10 things? The chief exec then says, well, there are a couple of urgent things. Fine, understood. Have we got long enough? So one of the boards I'm currently chairing, over pandemic, they'd moved to shorter but more regular meetings. Now the world's going a bit more back to normal. I've said this just isn't working. We need longer meetings. We cannot get done everything we need to do in the time. I had it at my previous building society where I turned up and I was told board meetings were a certain length. And I looked at the agenda and I said, there is no way you can do this meeting in that length of time. Now, either the agenda's wrong or the meeting time's wrong. It's got to be one or the other, because I'm not prepared as a chair to sit in a 3-hour meeting when I know I've got a 4-hour agenda. It's going to be uncomfortable for me, for the board, for the executive. We won't get the decisions we need. Nobody's going to be happy. So getting all of those things right, way up front, way before ever the meeting, to me is such a key part of the chairman's role. Knowing how long you've got for each item and knowing whether it's for information, discussion, decision, and being clear in your mind how you're going to get to that decision. Knowing whether you've got a hard stop or a soft stop at the end of the day, have people got trains to catch, or are we staying overnight for a dinner, in which case it doesn't matter if we run 15, 20 minutes late. All of those really basic, simple, practical things mean that by the time I go into the meeting to start it at 9:30, I'm clear in my mind exactly what we're going to achieve, how we're going to achieve it. And you know your board. And this is back to something I said a little earlier about when you take on a chair role, getting to know people. So you will know that Fred normally is really invested in this sort of item, and we know there's going to be quite a lot from Fred on this topic. Fine, well, I've allowed time for that, and I'm going to make sure he gets his 2 penneth, but equally that he doesn't then hog the board so nobody else gets to have a say. Or on this topic, I know actually it's normally quite difficult to get debate going because the exec are very keen, but perhaps the non-exec struggle to engage. So I know I'm going to have to work hard to make sure. So for each item, whether it's just plain straightforward or whether it's a difficult one or a difficult to engage or somebody will hog the floor. So it's all of that prep long before you get to the meeting. As I say, it means that by the time I get there, hopefully I can then exude, I know what I'm doing. I know how this meeting needs to go, not in terms of decisions at all. I don't mean, the board will decide what it decides, but in terms of the running of the meeting, which I think then means as a non-exec, you can relax. You're not worrying about the meeting. You're worrying about your contribution to the items within it. I mean, it's no different from being an executive meeting. It's happened to us all, haven't we? You sit in this meeting and it's being badly chaired and you're thinking, why am I here? Are we ever going to get to the item I'm actually interested in? Why is so-and-so hogging why doesn't the chairman take control? And I think once you've been chaired by a good chairman and you know that's going to happen, you can relax and you can concentrate on the papers and what you need to say as a non-exec, your thoughts, your views. And hopefully that means the whole thing works for everybody.
Oh, brilliant. I've certainly experienced poor chairs where they're doing it on the hoof and it's just a disaster. How much time are you spending on that preparation?
I mean, at least double the length of the meeting. And I don't mean in terms of reading the papers. I mean, before all of that. So if the meeting's 3 hours, I might spend 6 hours in terms of prep, as well as reading the papers for the meeting. So in terms of talking through the agenda, working out the agenda, normally you might have 2 or 3 iterations of the agenda coming round, then getting my head around, well, the timings, the issues, who's going to be talking about what we need to get out of this, maybe another call with the chief exec to say, this item we said we're putting on, are we sure we're ready for it to come yet? Where exactly? Is it just an update report? So a lot of time to get my head round that whole meeting.
And you talked about knowing how to get to a decision. How do you do that? Because there's nothing worse than a board where the chair has already decided what's happening and it's prefigured and you sit there as a board member thinking, well, what's the point in us having the discussion? But equally, there's nothing worse than a chair who hasn't thought about how to structure that decision making and you all end up drifting.
Yeah.
How do you go about that?
So my start point is always, because these things are a balance, is understanding where the executive are coming from, because typically the paper will have been put up by the executive. Occasionally not, but almost always it'll be the executive. So understanding, what are they trying to get out of this? Do they want a decision, or do they just want some guidance or a bit of an update and a steer? And if they want a decision, what do they want? Do they want yes or do they want no? Which doesn't mean the board will have to go with it, but let's at least know where the executive are coming from and what slant they're going to be putting on it. I then do have to actually stop and think, well, what do I think? Because I'm a member as well as a chair. You do have a vote. So I try and get my head around, well, what do I think we should be doing? Is this too soon? Is this too expensive? Do I agree with the exec or not? If I don't, I will typically tell them. I'm not good at big surprises in board meetings. People who've had papers for a week and in the meeting sort of throw it at you and say, I think this is a load of rubbish. Well, could you phone me and maybe told me? So I would normally say to the exec, not sure about this paper, not sure I feel I can agree it. Sometimes that might mean they take the paper off. Other times they'll say, no, let's have the discussion. Fine. So get my head around. Then start thinking, have we had discussions like this before? How have people reacted? So I've got a bit of a sense of how the room will play out. But then when we come to it, I try and let it be a very, very free-flowing conversation and not too structured. Just let everyone chat within the time we've got. So if it's a big item, we've got an hour, let's have a good discussion and let the conversation flow. But keeping an eye on the fact, is everyone contributing? And then at an appropriate moment coming in and saying, actually, Sue, you've not said anything yet. What are your thoughts? So you make sure everyone's had a chance to really contribute, but in a nice, free-flowing, discursive kind of a way. And very, very often by the end of that, the consensus has started to emerge and everyone's saying, well, we're agreed, aren't we, that we're not going to do it, or we're agreed, aren't we are going to do it, or let's defer it for 3 months or whatever. A consensus will have started. And typically then I will just say, well, I think we're in agreement that we defer it for 3 months, and you'll see the nods and the exec will go, okay, and the decision will be recorded. So I try, if I can, to keep it at that sort of level. If it's not clear, or if it's clear there's going to be a division, I will then do the go round the table and say, okay, we've heard the discussions. So Fred, what's your view? Sue, what's yours? Jane, what's yours? Etc. At the end of that, you'll then have a number, 4 against 5-4 or whatever it may be. And that's when I think as chairman you have to step up to the plate and lead the board. So up until then, I don't think it's for me to lead it. I'll express my thoughts as well as everyone else. But at the end, I do think it's time to say, okay, so we're clearly split. It's split pretty evenly. It's a big decision on that basis. I don't think we should go ahead. Let's revisit this in 3 months. Or I recognise there are a couple of you who feel strongly against it, but the majority of the board, including me, feel this is the way we should go, so we are going to go this way.
So it's fascinating. This idea that you go around the boardroom saying, where are you, aye or nay, is something we have in executive roles as well. And one of the things that we've shifted towards is writing it down. There's this concept of wall writing on the basis that you don't want people to be influenced by or anchored by what others have said. And so you get everyone to write it down. And we do the same with thoughts on a particular topic. So we will get everyone to type their thoughts to a particular question. It forces everyone to engage and then share it collectively at the same time into a Google Doc. And then everyone can spend the time reading that. How do you think about that in the boardroom of, because sometimes there are advantages actually, as a chair of going first and shaping the discussion. But other times actually you need to be wary as a chair or a chief exec of influencing people and losing the sort of diversity of thought.
Yes, actually it's a really good idea. And it's something I do a lot at strategy days. A slight diversion, but I am a huge believer that the purpose of a strategy day is for everyone in the room to bring this. This is where you really earn your money. You bring your brain. So if anyone says to me, I'm preparing a 500-page pack for the strategy day, they rapidly get told they're not. For me, pre-reads for strategy is a few pages, real key high-level stuff that we need to focus on. And it's about, and very often I will do, okay, so the first key thing is, where do we think we want to be in 3-5 years? Right, let's get some post-it notes, stick them all up on the wall. Your point, not discussing it, so nobody's being led by anyone else. And you can see whether the board is or isn't aligned on, are we going for rapid growth? Are we pretty much happy to stay where we are? Is this not the time to expand? Or are we all over the place? And you get a very good sense of that. So I use the kind of write it down without talking a lot at the strategy sort of discussion. I mean, there are times certainly at boards, and let's be honest, probably towards the end of meetings, where I might do okay, time is getting short. We've talked about this item before. I think we know the agreement is we want to go forward. My sense is from the board, is everyone happy we do? And you might allow a few minutes for people to say, yes, I think so, but could we just tweak this or whatever? So I will lead, but I try only to do it where I'm pretty sure the board is already with me and they don't really want to spend half an hour talking about it. They're pretty clear that this is what we need to be doing. And again, back to my earlier points, that for me is also about structuring the agenda. I do think agendas are sort of perhaps a bit like a sandwich. You have to get some of the basic stuff done, your minutes and whatever, but in a way that's a good way of getting people settled in, back into the, oh yes, I'm at this board, yes, this is what we talked about last time, yes, oh, these are the people in the room, get your head around it. Then the real meat of the meeting, and then some of the stuff at the end, which again, perhaps committee reports, stuff which you can read, you don't necessarily have to debate. When people are getting a bit tired, 3 or 4 hours of this might be, quite mentally tiring. You're ready for a quieter hour at the end of the more day-to-day stuff. And if you're short of time, you can then compress it rather than having to compress some of the key items. So it's back to that getting the agenda right in the first place.
I love that. I haven't heard that before. Board meeting like a sandwich. That's excellent. The other interesting thing that we've wrestled with as an executive team is we've shifted, inspired actually by a book coming out of Amazon called Working Backwards, to a narrative structure. Again, as a way to bring out the introverts versus the extroverts, and as a way to make the most efficient use of our meetings, that we've already done the thinking, I suppose, much as you would as a board. And it's really raised a question in my mind, which is, what is the purpose of bringing people together in a discussion when you can digest information so much more efficiently when it's written down? But at the same time, we are seeing that if you only have that written word, you lose. And it goes back, I think, a little bit to some of the things you talked about earlier around feelings and the human element of it. But how do you think about, when do you have pre-discussions and pre-written stuff with board members outside of the boardroom versus when is it valuable to have that free-flowing discussion?
Typically, I try to avoid the pre-anything because it all too easily slips over into pre-decision and you get to the board and it's all decided anyway, so what's the point? What I will do is pre-discussion if it's an item that is a bit shocking, a bit new, a bit unexpected, so that it doesn't turn up as shocking, new and unexpected, so people are ready and understand why it's being put forward. Or if it is an item where I know somebody feels incredibly strongly, I will give them a ring and say, let's just have a chat about this. It is coming up again. I know you're very anti or very pro and are unhappy we decided not to last time. Let's just talk that through. So back to my point that once you get to the board meeting, I don't like big surprises and big shocks. The time should be on the proper discussion, not the kind of, how dare you throw this at the board at this last minute, and why has this come to a sort of conversation? Which I don't think is helping anybody. Or if it's a topic where I feel perhaps, and this happens, the board isn't really engaging, I might make some phone calls to say, come on, this is on the agenda again. We've got to have a better discussion than we had last time. Why is it you're not able to engage on this? Do you need some more training on the topic? It's technical, it's something you don't feel. Or are the papers turgid? Is it just that the papers are rubbish? Let's get the papers better. Why is it that as a board we're not engaging on this? So absolutely, I will pre-prepare if it's something where I think there could be an issue or a conflict or a problem, not to stop debate and not to stop criticism or points being raised in the board, but to ensure they're done in the best possible way that is helpful for the executive. So back to your earlier point, the exec need decisions from the board, which again is why I'm not really in favour of papers being there just for information. As you say, those you can read, can't you? Why do they have to be on a board agenda? The board really should be for things where it matters that you've got together to discuss it.
Got it. You've touched now a couple of times on the potential conflict between the CEO and the board. Sometimes you said the exec will take papers off if you disagree, and sometimes they'll leave them on. And I know, again, from some of the research for this call, that you've navigated successfully some very tricky board dynamics with where there have been conflicts. What's your approach to that? What are the mental models, the tools that you're using in those situations? And to the extent you can, it would be great if you can sort of talk about some examples without breaking any confidence.
Starting at the end, I mean, the example I gave earlier of people picking at things is probably a good example of it never came to out-and-out conflict, although it was certainly leading to a difficulty in getting to a decision. And then you come to the next board and somebody would try and reopen it, and other people would be saying, but didn't we decide this last time? And then other people would say, yes, we did, but, and there's something wrong. And so for me, that's sort of going back to basics, clearing the air, clearing the papers, and saying to people, come on, what do you think? Not say what the papers are saying. What are your thoughts? What's your brain telling you about this? Let's go right back to basics. I've taken myself down the rabbit hole of the example now. I've lost the broader question.
What about the scenario where you've got a CEO that's not right as a chair? How do you handle that? Because that's a really difficult conflict to handle, isn't it? I remember one chair once saying, your job as the chair is to be the CEO's biggest supporter in public and biggest critic in private, which I always thought was an interesting way of thinking about it. But when you've got that CEO that's not right, how do you handle that situation?
Well, the start point, how sure are you they're not right? Is it just you? Is it them? Is it you? However, you very quickly come to understand whether it is just you or whether it is the whole board. And if the whole of the rest of the board is sure that it's the wrong CEO, ultimately you have to sit down and have the conversation. And I've had to. Thank you so much, but for the organisation we are and going forward, you're no longer the right person. Goodbye. So yes, I mean, ultimately that is what you have to do. But as you will have gathered from the way I've talked about most things today, only when you're really sure that the board is sure that's the right decision. So it should not ever be that you as the chairman are finding it difficult to work with that chief exec. That, to me, is sort of irrelevant. That's the chairman's problem. If the whole board can't work with the chief exec, and there are a range of examples of why, so it's not just on a topic or on a particular mannerism or characteristic, but there's a broad range of, the finances are all over the place, people are leaving in droves, the strategy isn't gaining any traction, nothing's been developed, a range of different ways of measuring metrics. The board are saying enough's enough. Then you just have to grasp that nettle. And I don't know if that sounds as if I would let it go a long time. I wouldn't. I mean, this might be a matter of weeks that would really emerge. And I think you need to get on and do it. The company will suffer the longer that goes on. And so if the board is decided, it needs to be done and done quickly. It doesn't need to be, let's give it 6 months and see how it goes.
And do you have a framework for thinking about that? I know Reid Hoffman uses a traffic light system where he ensures every board he's on has a green, orange, red status for the CEO and periodically reviews that with the board. Do you have any sort of framework that you use for thinking about that, or is it more of an intuition?
Both. So one thing I do with every board I work on, it when I possibly can, is get feedback straight after the board meeting, one way or another. So at some places it's very formalised, with a form will come round and you fill it in and it goes back. And at the next board, you will then look at the results from the previous board. Other boards, it's less formal, might be some phone calls, might be some emails, but making sure you get that feedback after each board meeting as chair, I think, is key. What went well, what didn't. You typically know yourself, but others will have thoughts and views. In terms of managing the chief exec, because as chair, you are the chief exec's line manager. Ultimately, that's still your role. I tend to work on a balanced scorecard approach. So making sure that you've got the metrics right. Well, making sure you've got the quadrants right. So is it people? Is it members? Is it money? Is it growth? What are the 4 measures? And then making sure we've got the right metrics within them and that the board is happy with all of those, that we agreed that is what we want the chief exec doing this year. and then quarterly measuring against that and reporting back to the board. So, I mean, you could easily do that as a traffic light. I mean, each quadrant could be red, amber, green. Typically, I don't. Typically, it's more of actually percentage achievement is typically what I use. And interestingly, talking at one of my organisations where we are transitioning CEO and the new CEO is coming in, one of my first talks with him, and he was saying, how do you suggest I manage the board and work with you? And I said, for me, using the balanced scorecard. We've put it in place for a reason. So when we have our fortnightly discussions, let's talk through each of the quadrants. If it were me, I'd have it pinned up. So almost weekly, I could look at it and say, have I been working across all 4 quadrants, or am I stuck in one corner? And if so, why? It's very easy as a chairman then, when you're talking to your chief exec, if all he can talk about is one of the corners, say people, but never talks about any of the other 3, you've got a problem. You need to help him or her work across that broader spectrum. It's a bit like traffic lights. It's a very easy way of ensuring your chief exec is sort of keeping all the balls in the air, I suppose.
Got it. And you share that with the whole board. It's a transparent thing, is it, rather than something for yourself?
Completely. Yeah.
Okay, and just one last question. I mean, you've had phenomenal experience. For those who are starting out today, looking for their first non-exec role, what's your advice?
Again, very, very simple, but let me explain what I mean by it. Really want to do it. If you don't start applying. You have to be sure it is right for you, and it isn't right for everybody. Just because you've had a good executive career does not mean you are going to enjoy being a non-exec. Many do, but not all, and be sure you do, because what I want as chair more than anything else is enthusiasm and commitment. If you're not interested, if you don't want to be there, if you aren't prepared, if you're not willing to take on an additional role when things get tough or somebody leaves unexpectedly, if you're not prepared to get involved in the business when, say, COVID hits and suddenly we have to step up to weekly board meetings, if that doesn't sound appealing, please don't do it. If it does sound appealing, I almost don't care what your background is. We can provide lots of training. Any organisation can provide lots of training to get you up to speed on the technicalities. Other board members can talk to you about the way boards work and how committees work, etc., and what's expected. But if you don't really want to be there, it's going to be hard work for you, and it's going to be damned hard work for everyone else around you. We've all seen it. We've all been in boards and committees where there's somebody who doesn't really want to be there. Maybe they misunderstood the role. Maybe they just quite liked getting the prestige on their CV, or bluntly, they like the money. It's quite hard work. I mean, as we've talked today, there's a lot to do around this. If you don't want to be there, it's not going to be fun for you, and it won't be fun for anyone else.
So true. And I think that also applies actually at the other end of the spectrum. I've seen lots of blue chip board members who just don't engage, and often they've been great at catching the right wave. But an organization sometimes get that wrong. They go for the person who's got the blue chip CV and they haven't really diligenced. Have they got the engagement? Are they really passionate about what it is that they as an organization do? And they've certainly got the insight, but without that engagement, it's very difficult to access that insight. So I think that applies to both ends.
Exactly that. Yeah. And think about how many roles you want. Think about how big a portfolio you want and how many you can take on at any one time. And balance that as well for you. I mean, it'll be different for different people, but there is a limit for many people as to how many they want, and just think that through.
Fantastic. And I could keep talking to you forever. It's been absolutely fascinating, but I want to wrap up with our 5-question quickfire, if that's all right. So this is where I'll ask you a short question and then you give me your response, if that works.
Off you go.
So your favorite book that you think every boardroom member should read, and why?
Well, it's very old, and I don't know even if it's still in print, but it's called Maverick. And it was by a Brazilian industrialist who, way back many years ago, came up with the idea that you actually needed to treat your employees like adults and let them come to work in what they felt it was appropriate to wear, and let them decide if they needed an office to sit in and what colour they wanted that office painted, etc. And it taught me an awful lot about treating people properly and as adults and as people, not as employees or board members, but as just human beings who would like to be treated the way you would like to be treated.
Brilliant. That sounds like one of my favourite books, Drive by Daniel Pink, where he talks about autonomy, mastery, purpose, so the surprising truth of what motivates people, which was a complete eye-opener. Love that. Your favourite quote and why?
Oh, favourite quote? It's the French, Edith Piaf, je ne regrette rien. I regret nothing. So not in an awful way, not as in I do terrible things, don't regret it, but as in try to seize every opportunity. Don't get older going, I wish I had, or I wish I'd tried, or I wish I'd done. Give it a go. Try it.
Brilliant. Your favourite holiday ever?
Namibia.
Wow. And anywhere particular there?
Well, we did a multi-centre holiday of various safaris, seeing all sorts of amazing animals. I just love holidays where you get to see wildlife of one sort or another, and Namibia was utterly stunning. Utterly stunning.
Your favourite restaurant?
Well, I really like a lot of sort of high-end food when I can get there, and expensive, Three Rosettes types. But actually, for a restaurant for day-to-day that does, I think, a really, really good job, Cote Brasserie. You can't go wrong with a nice French meal at Cote. With friends, local, lovely.
Fantastic. Great one. And your favourite app?
Well, it's called Eat Your Books. So I'm a keen cook, and it enables you to enter all the cookbooks that you own, and they have then indexed them so you can search by recipe, by ingredient, by type, and you will know you have got the cookbook that it refers to. So if you go to your fridge and you find you've got a glut of something or the other, you type it into this app and it tells you all the recipes you've got to use that particular thing that you've got loads of.
Oh, wow. I love that. I'm going to be downloading that after this. Fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. If you're a keen cook and you've got loads of cookbooks, it's a way of keeping track of all the different recipes. Or you're thinking, God, I know I've got a recipe for this somewhere, but which book's it in? You put it in the app and it will tell you which book.
Brilliant. Joanne, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed this.
I have too. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.